Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the drapery shop. I am actually fan folding this enormous one-way left drapery in this gorgeous purple linen, and it's blackout lined, so it's pretty heavy and has 8 widths of fabric. It's a lot of fabric to manage and fan fold, which is why I like to fan fold before I take it over to the machine to sew the pleats, because it gets it all organized and gets the folds created in a very organized, accurate fashion, rather than taking this whole pile to the machine, sewing the pleats, and then fan folding. By doing it in this order of fan folding and then sewing pleats, the whole drapery will be fan folded very accurately and the pleats will hang very parallel to the walls. I like to start on the side of the table that you see me on, which is on the left side, depending where you're standing in the room. I'm on the left side of the table, which is the return of this drape, since it's a one-way left, so that the whole drape stacks to the left of the sliding door. So that means the return is on the left. And even if this was a one-way right, I would start on this side of the table. That would mean I would start on the leading edge. So in this case, it's the return, and before you get the first pleat folded, you want to get the whole edge of the drapery lined up with the edge of the table. So just like in tabling, I'm still using the table as kind of a guide to keep the fabric square and straight and everything. And this doesn't have to be perfect, but it's just a nice way to start on that first fold to get everything lined up accurately, because the first fold is your baseline and you're gonna measure everything off of that first fold. As I go, you'll see I'm gonna be pressing every pleat before I fold it over. And then we'll go measure from the top the first fold, and so you'll match up the first 2 pins, and that means your first 2 pins is going to be your first pleat. So the first pin marks off the return, and then the next one marks off your pleat. So match up the first 2 pins, join them up, and where they fold, where they create a fold line, you'll measure from the fold line to the edge of the return, the side hem, and that's how much you're going to measure over at the bottom to fold under the first section of fabric, which is the return. It's actually the return in half of the pleat. So if your pleat is 3 inches and your return is 6 inches, that means you're going to measure 9 inches over. And so then you can get that started, and then make sure that you have that same 9 inches folded under all the way down the first pleat. From the edge of the table, you can measure, and you could see it, and you can feel that bump underneath the first fold of your side hem. And so you want to make sure that the first fold is nice and consistent. After you fold over the first pleat, you want to check that you have the same amount of fabric turned under all the way up and down that first pleat, so that you have a really good starting point, because every fold after this one is going to be measured from the previous, and the next one from the previous, and the next one from the previous. So you always want to be as accurate as you can. And so if you can check that first one, you can see the bump of it underneath the fabric, and you can feel it also. So once you have that first one set and you're happy that it's measuring the same all the way down the table, then you can press the next section of fabric while it's laying flat on the table. Pressing as you go is the best way to ensure that as many wrinkles as possible are getting steamed out of the fabric. If you were to press this as you were tabling, it's still going to wrinkle, because you'll have to move it around, whether you bring it to the hemmer or just to get it turned over, or just to finish tabling. And it helps the fabric to fan fold accurately. So now we're going to the next pleat, where you measure from the first one to the second one at the top, and then you go to the bottom and you can measure that out and pull it over. And one really important trick that I do to help keep all the lining together, especially with so many widths, is keep your pins in the seams while you're fan folding. So as you're tabling, don't take those pins out. Leave them in there. And as you're fan folding, having the pins in the blackout is going to keep the blackout with the face fabric. And right now I'm adjusting some of those folds at the bottom because I'm checking that my seam is the same distance away from the fold all the way up and down. So every time you get to a seam, you can check that your folds are coming out the same from the top of the drape to the bottom by measuring the seam to the fold. And then if you're off anywhere, you can make adjustments. Sometimes there's a little variation from the top to the bottom. And so the seams are a good time to stop and evaluate if you're folding accurately. Sometimes the amount of fabric that you grab and pull over at the bottom might need to be a little bit less or a little bit more because of all of the hems in there. It might get too bulky. And so you're gonna keep going and just keep doing the same steps. Press, measure the top, measure the bottom, pull it over. And you can see I'm doing this by myself. If you have a helper, it's gonna go a lot faster and be a lot easier. But actually enjoy the process of fan folding. It's very satisfying after spending all of the time to cut the fabric and sew it together, table it, put the header in, mark the pleats. By the time I get to this step, I feel like I've actually created something and I'm seeing it come to life by fan folding. And then I know once I'm finished fan folding, I can tie it up in nice bows, and then it's almost finished with just the sewing of the pleats and tacking to go, so that I know it's almost done. And if you have some clamps that you can clamp to the side of the table to help keep the stack from falling off the table, that helps too sometimes. If this was any bigger, if this had any more widths to it, I would have needed something to keep it from falling off the table. And the reason it's going so well is because the pins are still in the blackout. If they weren't, that blackout would be shifting all over the place and it would be really challenging and frustrating. And so you just don't want to forget, after you tie up the drape, after it's totally fan folded, just tie up a couple of sections so it doesn't fall over, and then fish out all of those pins. Keep track of how many rows, how many seams you have, so you can make sure you pull out all of the rows of pins. And another tip for a very large drapery when you're fan folding, if you get so tall at the header with the pleats stacked up, you can pull the header off the table and have them kind of hanging off the table and keep fan folding. And that way the header doesn't get taller than the rest of the drape. That's a really good trick somebody taught me years ago. And the reason I measure each pleat to pleat at the top is because this drape is so big, I had to alter my pleat and space calculations a little bit in each width, so they're not the same all the way across the drape. If it was, if all the pleats were the same, all the pleats and all the spaces, I could have just measured the first one and then used that number every time I folded over the bottom. But because I made slight variations all the way through this drape, I measured every single time for accuracy. Right here, this is a pleat because there's more space between this pin and this pin. And here's a space and here's a space. So on either side of this big section, that's the pleat. Either side of that would be a space because they're smaller. And typically your spaces will be smaller than your pleats if there is a nice amount of fullness. If this drapery did not have a lot of fullness, this pleat might be the same size as the space. But this drapery has a nice amount of fullness, and this is what happens in that case, which is what I prefer. So I prefer that the pleats are bigger than the spaces, and that way your drapery will hang really beautifully. I try to always put the seams in the spaces, not in the pleats. So right here, you can see this is where this seam is. You might need a yardstick. I'm working right now with an 18-inch ruler, but you can measure from the fold over to the seam in several sections and make sure that that seam is even with the edge of all of your folds. So it's nice to check as you're going that you're doing a good job of keeping the folds parallel to all the seams, and that way you'll be really sure to know that your drapes are going to hang really nicely after they're installed. Because if your seams are crooked, if they're folded in crooked, then they're gonna get trained that way, and it's really hard. Even if you steam the drape after installation, it's really hard to untrain a poorly trained drapery. So it's really, that's why I'm kind of going over it again and again, because that's just really important to make sure that your drapery will hang nice and straight. And this fabric is really cool. You can see all of the distressing. It's a distressed linen that was somehow treated to look like it's very old and crinkly. One thing you can see is in every space, there is a pin in the header. So when I take this, you can see the pleats stacking up over here. When I take this over to the machine to sew the pleats, I don't have to worry about sewing over any pins that are in the header in the pleat area. They're only in the spaces. That's one of the habits that I've created, to only pin the header in between the spaces. That's just to keep the header together until all the pleats are stitched, and then all those pins will come out. And if you have somebody helping you, one person can stay at the top and one person can stay at the bottom, and you can each kind of fill in the middle parts, and it helps go a lot faster. But like I said, I enjoy this process of fan folding and don't mind doing it by myself. So this whole stack here that gets really tall, that's the part where if you pulled the whole drapery off the table, just so that 4-inch header could hang off the table, you could keep folding the same way, and that this big stack, it would start to kind of get taller and stand up. But having it off the table helps to keep that stack from getting so tall that it might fall over. I was able to keep this all on the table without it falling over, but it was getting a little precarious, and I have had a tall stack fall over on me, and you have to catch it or start over again. You can tell that the hem also gets tall, but typically the header usually gets taller. So it does get a little tricky to keep everything even in the middle because of that, but it still works out. And everything still hangs nicely. And so this would be the leading edge, since this is the return under here. And again, you want to make sure you press your side hems. And the very last one. Finally, I made it to the end, and you can see that all the lining is stacking up nicely on the inside. That's because all the pins at the seams were left in, and you can't see any of them because they're all buried in there, but I'll have to go through and fish them all out. And here you can see all the pins in the spaces. There's no pins in the front where the pleats are folded toward the front. Besides these pins here, the only ones in the header are the ones back here, and the reason you only see those back there is because each one is in the middle of a space. And there it is, all done. Thank you so much for watching, and we're gonna put out a very extended version of this video so that you can play it if you would enjoy having it going while you're working and maybe fan folding your own drapery in your own workroom. So check that out. We'll give this a test to see if you enjoy what they call body doubling in the extended version of this video. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and thanks for watching. See you next time.